For those of you visiting, we've been doing a series of lessons through 1 Corinthians, and this week we'll be in the text of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 12 through 24. And I've titled this Remain As You Are, and I think you'll see why. One of the things that Paul's been dealing with is discontent in the Corinthians' current situation. If they're married and now they've become a Christian, maybe they're questioning, well, I should get out of this marriage. Or if they're single, not being content with that and wanting to get married. And there's going to be some questions that come up, well, what if I'm married to an unbeliever? And just different situations that become not content with their own spouse and going after prostitutes and sexual immorality and those sorts of things. But like we've been doing, and especially for our visitors and those of you who haven't been to all these lessons, I'm going to do a little bit of a reminder of what we've covered so far. In chapter 1, we have this great introduction where Paul lets them know that they were called through the gospel into Jesus Christ. They were sanctified or made holy in Christ. That idea of called and sanctified is a theme that runs throughout the book, and we're going to see that in this passage we're looking at today. Two problems they had right off the bat. One was exalting men, human leadership. They'd say, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas. The other thing was exalting human wisdom, rejecting the apostolic authority that Paul had, the spiritual revelation that Paul was delivering to them, exalting their own thinking above that. Chapter 2, Paul emphasizes that faith must be through God's power, not in signs and wonders. You know, Greeks, Jews look for signs. Greeks, they look for wisdom. Paul said, my preaching didn't come in that. I came in weakness. And in fact, God's truth doesn't come through man's wisdom, so he's building up the idea that spiritual revelation is needed from God. We talked about that as one of the themes this morning in mysticism versus materialism, and we were talking about the book of John. Spiritual revelation is needed because man can't get there through his own thinking. And you know, Paul, as he was writing to the Corinthians, he is inspired by the Spirit. He's been revealed spiritual revelation. He's trying to get them to accept it. And by implication, if they think they're so spiritual there in Corinth, well, then they should listen to spiritual revelation. Chapter 3, what we get into is the irony that if they're so spiritual, then why are they divided? Because you can't be spiritual and divided at the same time. And then he talks about they had false views of servants, and he tries to correct those false views by telling them about by giving them a picture of what the apostles themselves are going through. And he says this is a true picture of a servant, and how it's in contrast to their own view. He talks about Jesus Christ, the only foundation that's laid. He gives a warning to people who would destroy God's temple or God's building, and in fact he says that all are Christ's. So I got a little ahead of myself when he's talking about the example of the apostles here in chapter 4. He reminds them that regardless of what they think about him as an apostle, Christ is going to be the one that judges all of his servants. And he talks about all the hardships they go through. And then at the end of chapter 4, he gives them this choice. He turns as a father. He says, you know, I can come with a rod, or I can come with a spirit of gentleness when I come. And he hopes that he'll be able to come with a spirit of gentleness when he finally does arrive. But he has to deal in chapter 5 with some sexual immorality that's going on. A man has his father's wife, and he's encouraging them to take action. They haven't taken action on that. And so he gives an analogy of the Passover. Just like in the Passover, you had to get all the leaven out of the house and eat unleavened bread. He says it's the same way with the church and immorality. You have to clean house because the church is supposed to be pure and holy, and that we are given the job of judging those that are within. He also turns to people who are taking claims against each other in chapter 6, taking people to court, having arguments. It really boils down to shaming the church. He says, if you're so wise, do you not have anybody wise enough to determine these little matters among you? Why bring shame on the church? You've already lost. You're trying to win an argument, but you've already lost by your behavior. And he gives, in fact, a warning against a whole laundry list of wrongdoers. And by implication, he's implicating them in that laundry list of things. And in chapter 6, we talked about being mastered. Later in the chapter, he gives a choice. You can be mastered by your own physical desires, or you can be mastered by the Lord. He talks about being joined. You can be joined to a harlot in sexual immorality, or you can be joined to the Lord. You got to choose. You can't be both. You have to make a decision about what you're going to do with your body. You're going to dishonor God in your body or glorify God in your body. He gives those contrasts through at the end of chapter 6. And then earlier, last week, a week before last, we talked about 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the beginning of it. First, he addresses the marriage. the married people. They had some questions about whether it was better to be celibate. Now that we're supposed to be joined to the Lord, well, maybe we should just leave our wives, or maybe we should just be celibate inside our marriage relationships. And he emphasized that no, that the married have a responsibility to fulfill each other's sexual desires. He talks to the unmarried and the widows. These are people who had never been married, the virgins and widows, and he says, you know, I wish that everybody could be like me, being single, but I realize that not everybody's going to be that way. It's no sin if you do marry. And then he gives a final exhortation there in chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. He's saying, don't separate from your spouse. Stay together. And really we need to understand this in the context of the Corinthians. They had some question that perhaps a stronger devotion to Christ would mean, not being a virgin your whole life. Or or maybe if you were more dedicated to Christ, maybe you just leave your spouse and just serve Christ. And he's setting the record straight on that and saying, no, that's not how things should work. And so today's outline, a lot of times you have a 3-point sermon. Today you get a 2-point sermon. We're going to talk about 2 sections of this text. The first one, verses 12 through 16, is really don't separate from unfaithful spouses or unbelieving spouses. Most translations look at this meaning somebody who's not a Christian. And the second part is there's just guiding principle that just all through this section of text. And the idea is remain as you are. Be content in your current situation and just be content to serve the Lord. Whether you're single, whether you're married to a non-believer, whether you've been widowed, just be content to serve the Lord in the state that you're in. So let's look at the text in verses 12 through 16. And I'm going to read this, and then we'll go through it and look at each one in more detail. So as I turn in my text here, we'll pick up, I'll be reading, this is from the New American Standard Version, 1 Corinthians 7, starting in verse 12. He says, but to the rest I say, again, he's addressed the married and the unmarried and the widows. He says, to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. But God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Now, if you're like me, that text is a little confusing, isn't it? Like, what does he mean? What is he talking about? Well, I hope that we can make some sense out of it. And if you have a different idea, you think I've missed the boat, hopefully you'll tell me after class we can have or after the sermon, we can have a good conversation about that. I want to point out in verse 8, he had addressed the unmarried and he had addressed the widows. Well, these key phrases where he says, to the married, to the widows, verse 10, to the unmarried and to the widows in verse 8. In verse 10, to the married. And who are the rest? In verse 12 he's talking about. He says, and to the rest. Who are the rest? Well, by the context, it seems like the rest are these people, as we go on through this text, the rest are people who are believers, but are married to unbelievers. Okay, so that would mean in context, he's talking about people who are not married, people whose spouses have died, Christians who are married, they should not separate. And now he gets to the rest, which when we read in the context here, these are believers who are married to unbelievers. Now, why would that be interesting? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment because they're going to have some questions. Now that I'm a Christian, is it okay for me to stay married to my unbelieving spouse? And in verse 12 he says, I say, not the Lord. And some people look at this and they say, well, this is just Paul saying it. I don't have to listen to Paul because that's just Paul's opinion. So I want to kind of set the matter straight on this. When we get into some situations where we don't like something that Paul says, they'll just dismiss it, right? And say, well, that was just Paul saying it. It wasn't the Lord saying it. But Paul is not, he's not simply voicing an uninformed opinion. Up to this point in the text, we've talked about several times where he said he had spiritual revelation. He was the apostle sent to them to teach them, right? So he is saying something that carries the authority and insight of an apostle. It's like, who do you want to take advice from? Do you want to take advice from any old, guy on the street? Or would you rather take advice from somebody who had spiritual revelation? Holy Spirit was with him. He had been sent to give you guidance in how to follow the Lord. So it carries all the authority of an apostle, all the insight and spiritual revelation of an apostle. And notice in verse 10, where Jesus taught on something, he would give Jesus' teaching. In fact, when he talked about how a man and woman shouldn't separate, I think he's referring back to the teaching in Matthew about how God joined them together, let not man separate. He didn't quote it directly, but he's paraphrasing. So the Lord had said that, and so he gives it. But where the Lord had not directly given a teaching, well, he's going to give his apostolic teaching on that. I hope that makes sense. And if you see it differently, you can let me know afterwards. And so the question may come up is, should a Christian put away a spouse? Well, he had already answered that previously, early in the chapter, that no, you shouldn't do that. So, but then the next question may come up, well, what if they're an unbeliever? Is it okay, or should I do this? Should I put away an unbelieving spouse? And we look at verse 12 and 13, and he's going to answer that. He says, if any brother has an unfaithful, and this is my translation. The reason I do these, by the way, is so that, if you're like me, I read this New American Standard Bible, and I've read it, sometimes I just kind of gloss over a text. And I'm not forced to see it in a new way because I'm so familiar with it. That by presenting this to you, I hope that if you see something that piques your interest, you may go and compare it to your own translation and dig in a little bit more. But that's why I do these. He says, if any brother has an unfaithful woman and she agrees to dwell with him, and by implication we know that if somebody has a woman, that's his wife. But that's literally what it's saying. And so if you have an unfaithful woman and she agrees to dwell with you, let him not put her away. And if any woman has an unfaithful man and this one agrees to dwell with her, let her not put away the man. So when I do my translations, I do it very literal. I don't take shortcuts and use the word divorce, or I don't use husband and wife. I just use the very literal word there. Now, what had happened is that many people were being converted after they had already been married. He's writing to the church in Corinth. You have some people who are two Gentiles. One of them becomes converted and becomes really strongly convicted to follow Christ, and they're wondering, well, what should I do about this union over here? Should I keep it or should I get out of it? And what his teaching is that the Christian is not supposed to initiate the separation in this case. Now, you'll notice in this whole passage that there's two phrases. One is to put away, let him not put her away. The other one we may see is separated. Now, if I'm understanding this right, when put away means, when he says don't put away, that is my action. I'm putting distance between me and somebody. If somebody else is separating themselves, some translations say depart, that means they are initiating the action, okay? So, hope that's not too confusing. You can ask me if that didn't make sense, but if we can look at it this way, you don't cause the action, you don't initiate the action, let somebody else initiate the action. And to make sense of this, I'm going to skip verses 14, and I'm going to jump down to verse 15 where he picks up that line of argumentation again. He says, and if the unfaithful one is separated, meaning they depart, let him be separated, or let them do it. You don't do it, you let them do it. So the unbeliever should be initiating the action. And he says, the brother or sister, the one who's a Christian, is not enslaved in such as these situations, meaning they're not in bondage, they're not compelled to dwell with somebody who doesn't want to dwell with them. Does that make sense? He's not saying anything about remarriage in this situation. He's just telling the Christians who are concerned about what should I do with an unbelieving spouse. He's saying, just keep living with them. You don't initiate any separation. If they initiate it, then so be it. And the reason he says, and God has called us to peace. Now, I always thought that was, what does he mean by that? But what I think he means by that is Christians we are peacemakers. We don't initiate disunity. So in this situation where a believer is with an unbeliever, you live peaceably with them. You don't initiate that. If they want to run off and leave you, then that's fine. You're not under bondage. You're not enslaved to do that. Well, let's go back and this is the question I ask is, can we show peace by putting away a spouse? That's, if we're trying to proclaim a message of peace, if one Corinthian had been married, if two Gentiles had been married in Corinth and one became a Christian, Well, they're more likely to share the gospel of peace by living peaceably with that person and not just throwing them out or separating themselves from them. And the next question that may come up, well, is the marriage even legitimate now that I'm a Christian? I'm bonded to Christ and here I am with this unbeliever. Is the marriage even legitimate? Are my children even legitimate? You know, there all these questions or implications may come up. And I think he's going to address that in this next verse, in verse 14, which I've often wrestled with, and if you have a different idea on it, let me know. He says, "For the unfaithful man has been sanctified in the woman, and the unfaithful woman has been sanctified in the brother. Otherwise, your children are impure, now they're holy." Now, we know in the Old Testament that mixed marriages were forbidden. So if you happen to be a Jew, you would have really been concerned now that you're following God, what am I supposed to do? Because I read the Old Testament, mixed marriages are a no-no. Meaning, not racially mixed, but one's following God and one's following after a pagan idol. So the question is, I mean, when we know this from Deuteronomy 7:3 and Ezra, we saw them putting away their wives and their children, and also Nehemiah. So he's reminding them that, you know what? If your marriage weren't holy, your children would be unholy too. But they're not. You know, so he's basically using that by implication that, you know, that this is not an unholy marriage. So what I believe he means by sanctified is that the marriage is holy. The marriage is a good thing, that their children are good. He says, otherwise your children would be impure, and that literally means mixed, meaning believer and unbeliever, or they would be just like the Old Testament reference would, but now they're going to be holy. The marriages are now sanctified, which implies a changing of the law, right? From the Old Testament law to the New Testament law. Now, if you think I missed the boat on that, let me know, but in context, it seems to make sense with what he's been saying, is that he's probably answering an opposition they have and a question they have of whether or not it's okay to be married to these unbelievers. Well, what else? Why else would I remain with an unfaithful spouse? Are there any other reasons? And he tells us in verse 16, he says, well, what do you know if you might save the person? Or what have you known, man, if you might save the woman? Meaning, you could actually end up converting them by staying. If the option is, I'm a Christian, I'm living with an unbeliever, you know, it's really difficult, and I may have some questions about what God would ideally want me to do. Well, God is saying, you don't know for sure, but you might actually end up having an influence on them, convert them. It's no guarantee, and there's no way of knowing, but you'd have more influence being with them. And so that's the reason you remain, is for the possibility of persuading the spouse to follow Christ. Now here's something that I want to emphasize, and this is an important concept, okay? A lot of people come to this passage, they come to Corinthians, and they're looking for justification to get this whole marriage, divorce, and remarriage thing that comes up, you know. In the context, the Corinthians, they wanted permission or questioning about whether or not they should separate from their spouse. Many people come to this text today seeking permission to put away and remarry a spouse. But Paul is not addressing that situation. Now, I'm not saying we can't learn spiritual concepts from looking at this text, but we need to understand the text in which it was the context in which it was originally written, and that he's responding to brethren who are wondering, now that they're Christians, what should they do in terms of a marital situation? So he's encouraging them to remain as they are. That's the theme that we've seen all through this chapter is, you know, if you're a widow and you can stand to be a widow and you don't, you know, then stay a widow. If you're a virgin, you know, stay a virgin. But if you marry, it's not a sin. You know, he's going all these things, but he's originally saying just stay where you are. So when you're studying this, or if you're engaged in a discussion about this, and the idea of divorce and remarriage comes up, just keep in context what he's originally addressing in this text. And then we go on to the next section, 17 through 24. And I'd like to read this. This is chapter 7, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17. He says, "Only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this manner let him walk. And so I direct in all the churches. Was any man called when he was already circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He's not to be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. Each man must remain in that condition in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. But if you're able to become free, rather do that. For he who was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who was called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, each one is to remain with God in that condition in which he was called. And that is something you see that over and over and over through this passage, is this guiding principle that just be happy where you are. Be content where you are. It doesn't mean you may not find your social context changing, but don't be overly concerned with it or think that you can't serve God in your present social situation. And so we look at verse 17 where he starts out, he says, as the Lord has distributed each one, each as God is called, let him walk. And thus I direct in all the churches. See, he will begin in this section, he's going to start changing the context, but he's not changing his primary concern. And his primary concern is that they're worried about their status. Either they're married or they're celibate or they're slave or all these different things. And so Paul is restating this idea, that central theme throughout this is that just remain as you are. Be content to serve God as you are. He's not commanding that the married can't remarry or that the unmarried, he's not really concerned with that. He said ultimately you're too worried about these things and it's affecting your service to God. So he's saying that our faith is not affected by our social status. So what are two good examples of this? Well, he's going to use circumcision. He's going to use slavery to get his point across or to further illustrate his point. And the first one is circumcision. In verse 18, he says, anyone called having been circumcised, let him not become uncircumcised, right? Well, the literal translation is let him not draw out. You think, what does that mean? But think about it. How do you become uncircumcised? If you know what circumcision is, how do you become uncircumcised? Well, there's some historical accounts that people would actually try to reverse their circumcision through drawing out and recreating what was cut off. And he's saying, don't do that. Don't worry about that. If anyone's been called in foreskin, less literal, he says, let him not be circumcised. So there were some people, some Jewish Christians might have been trying to reverse their circumcision. That doesn't matter. Don't do that. Some Gentile Christians might seek acceptance by their Jewish brethren by getting circumcised. He says, don't do that. He says circumcision, and I think by implication, like he's made his point, he says circumcision, like marriage and like celibacy, it has no religious significance. You're not more religious if you're circumcised, and more religious if you're uncircumcised, more religious if you're married, more religious if you're single or celibate. He says none of this is what really matters. So what matters? He says the circumcision is nothing, the foreskin is nothing, but keeping the commands of God. That is what is important here. So you think about it, if you're in the first century, if you grew up a Jew, this is going to be a shocking statement, right? Because he's just said, did he just say the circumcision is nothing? Because to a Jew, the circumcision is everything, right? That is the sign of the covenant, that I am, chosen, and I am a relationship with God. And here he's saying, the circumcision is nothing. And so I think by illustration, he's making the point that marriage is irrelevant, celibacy is irrelevant, circumcision is irrelevant. All these things are irrelevant. Because if you look at this in context, you're thinking, he's been talking about sexual relations for the last chapter or so. And then later down in the next portion of the chapter, he's going to be talking about virgins and sexual relations. And then right here in the middle, he talks about circumcision and slavery. You're like, why? Well, I think he's talking about the same thing all the way through. That obedience is what matters, not our social status. And so in verse 20, he says, each in the calling in which he was called, and this let him remain. By calling, I think he means the situation that you're in. Christians don't need to change their situation to serve God. How many times have we heard, well, if I was just married, I could serve God better. Or if I was just single, my wife really, drags me down, or my husband really drags me down. If I was only single, I could serve God better. If I had this, I could serve God better. If I had that, I could serve God better. No, it doesn't make you any more spiritual. We need to serve God in whatever situation we might find ourselves. And he reminds them in verse 21, he says the situation here is if a slave you were called, or if you were called while a slave, don't be concerned about that. But, if you're able to become unbound, use it. And so I think he's using slavery to illustrate his point the whole way through. Don't be concerned about your status here, whether or not you're married, whether or not you're single, whether or not you're widowed, or these things, or whether you're slave, whether you're free. He says, if you can become free, that's great. Use it. But don't be overly concerned with it. Now, I'm thankful that we don't live in a world where slavery is prevalent. But who knows? We may get back there again. And if people were coming in here and enslaving all of us, we may really think, I can't serve Christ anymore. But he's saying, that is not the main thing. Keeping the commandments of God are the main thing. So my question is, are we too concerned with our current situation to serve? Are we making excuses? Am I concerned because I'm single? I can't serve God because of that. Or I can't serve God because I'm in this marriage. Maybe I can't serve God because we don't have slavery, but I'm enslaved to this boss. If I had a different boss, or if I had a different job, I could do this or that. And I'm guilty of making those excuses. We all are guilty at times of saying, when this happens, I'll do better. No, he's reminding them that you can do and serve God exactly where you are, because that's where you were when God called you. You're a servant of God right now. And Mike alluded to this point that wherever we're at, that's where God has us right now, right? So in verse 22, he says, "For the one in the Lord, having been called a slave, is the Lord's freedman. And like manner, the one having been called free is Christ's slave." So what he says is slaves are free in Christ. Freed people are slaves to Christ. So it doesn't matter. You're going to be enslaved either way. If you think you're going to have some great freedom, you can do what you want to do when this context changes, it's not true. Because if you think that, you've forgotten that you were bought with a price, that you should be enslaved to Christ. And that's what we need to ask ourselves. Have we forgotten that we are Christ's slaves? Sometimes we're thinking, I could just do so much better if I was in a different situation. No, you wouldn't. You would not. If you're not serving God at the fullest of where you're at, you're not going to think to serve God more fully. You're going to use that to do your own thing. You've forgotten that you're a slave to Christ. And so we can serve God no matter what state that we're in. In verse 23, he reminds them, he says, you're bought with a price. Don't become slaves of men. I was thinking about this verse. I love this verse because for me, my slavery was, I used to worship my career, And I had forgotten that, Christ had set me free, and I was thinking, why am I enslaving myself back again into some career? Career is good, and it's a tool, and he's not saying in this context that we can't improve our situation or anything like that, but I think the context is greater than that. The freed slave is still a purchased slave of Christ. Our loyalty and service must always be, first and foremost, Jesus Christ, whether or not it's to a job, but in this context, he may be talking about our master, or he may be talking about spouses. Why else would he say, if you're single, remain single? Remember earlier he said, because a single person can dedicate themselves to the Lord more fully. It's not a sin if you marry, but our first and foremost priority would be to Christ. He talked about being a slave to our desires. Remember that when he talked about sexual immorality? We could be a slave to our desires for prestige, for money, for social status, all these things. He talked about being slaves earlier to human wisdom and philosophies earlier in the book, to human leaders. So all these things apply when you look at the context. I used to look at Corinthians as a whole list of disjointed things. But no, it's a beautifully woven masterpiece of just being consistent, trying to get people to make Christ the first and foremost in their life. Even in chapter 1, the introduction, he says, you were called and sanctified in Christ. And here the point is, you were bought with a price. We need to realize that we are slaves of Christ and not be slaves to other people, other men, other things of this world. So in verse 24, he says, each one in which he was called, brethren, in this let him remain beside God. Be dedicated to God. Regardless of the situation, we're to remain and be solely dedicated to God. And by implication, I think he's saying it's not that God doesn't care about our status in life. He listens to our prayers, but ultimately that's not the main thing. It's irrelevant to our service to God. So we shouldn't put that much stock in it either, as some of them were. And here's our question. Are we content to serve God where we are? Are we content to serve God where we are right now? And that's what I'm going to leave you with today. That's what I want you to think about this week. Are you single? Well, it's not going to be a sin if you marry. You know, he says it's better to marry than to burn with passion. He said that. If you're a widow and you still have strong sexual desires, so it's not a sin to do that. But ultimately, we need to be making our decisions based on how can I best serve God. You know, if you're single, you can be married. If you're married, he's saying, you know, stay married. If you're a slave, don't be concerned about it. But if you can become free, do it. Do you see what his main point is in this? Is that oftentimes we are making excuses that if we had some different situation, that we could serve God better. We get focused on the wrong things oftentimes. God has placed each member in the body just as he desires at this moment in time. And we're each in different situations. Some of us are married, some of us are single. But we can serve God. Every day we have a choice. We get up. He gives us opportunities if we'll just open our eyes and take advantage of them. And what are we going to do with those opportunities? Are we going to think, oh, well, if it was just something different, if I had some more money or a different job or a different wife or a different husband, or I was single or I was married? No. That's junk. God sees through that. We may be fooling ourselves, but that's not true. We need to be excited about serving God now. We need to realize we were bought with a price. But that meaning we were sprung out of our misery, which was sin and death. But the implication of that is we have somebody to serve now. We were serving the world. We were serving ourselves. We were serving Satan. We were serving our desires. And now we're free to all that, but we've got to serve Christ. We have to serve Christ in whatever situation we're in. And so I want you to think about that. Are we content to serve Christ where we are right now? Maybe somebody here has never been sprung out of their sins. We want to give you that opportunity to do that this morning. Christ is willing he's shed his blood, and you've been bought with a price, and he wants to purchase you as a possession and for you to serve him. And some of you may need to rededicate, need to re-up and remember that you were bought with a price, and get busy serving him and be content to serve him where you're at. If we can help anybody this morning by way of invitation, we want to give you the opportunity to either recommit your life to Christ, ask for the prayers of the saints in this congregation, or